This presentation is your first introduction to object-oriented programming in processing. This is exciting. Let's get started. Stepping back to our Space Invaders example, we have lots of different things interacting on the screen. Lots of invaders, each of which has to pay attention to its location, its velocity, its animation state. While arrays simplify this process quite a bit by allowing us to do a lot with a few lines of code, wouldn't it be nice if there was a way to describe basically how the invader was supposed to act and move and display, and then simply let the invader take control of its own, handling its own processes? That's basically what the idea of object-oriented programming is about. Let's take a look at what's involved. When we write using object-oriented programming methods, we create classes. Classes have properties and methods, and we build objects from classes. Let's think of a quick example. If we were to create a class for the invader, we'd be describing how each invader hypothetically should move, should respond, and should act, while the individual invaders are the actual objects that are going to be running in our code. The properties of the invader might be its location, its color, things that it has. The methods of the invader are things that it does. Things like move, fire at the player, die. The constructor specifies how we build the invader and the information and data that we need before we can have an invader show up on the screen. The important thing to keep in mind here is that a class is a blueprint for an object. It's not the object itself. We can build many objects from one class. Again, the class being a blueprint for many different objects, each of which could have its own color or size or location, whatever. But the class specifies the general behavior about those objects. So let's look at an example in code. If we were to write a class for the invaders of Space Invaders, it might look something like this. At the top you see class and then the name of the class, invader. We usually capitalize the names of classes to indicate that it's a class rather than an object. The variables are what you see at the top, x, y, and how fast the invader is moving. Next, we see the constructor. This is kind of like a special kind of a function that describes the information we need to know when we build a new invader. All it does is simply set the values for the variables of the invader. Down below, you'll see methods, which again look like special kinds of functions that simply refer to the invader itself and how it behaves. Back in the main part of your code, this is how you would use the invader. What we're seeing here at the top is one invader being declared. Inside of setup, we're actually instantiating a new invader. When I say instantiate, I simply mean giving an instance of the invader, creating one individual invader that in this case is named Ralph. Down below, we're seeing dot syntax that tells Ralph to display and to move. That dot syntax simply refers to the dot in between Ralph and his methods. Stepping back to the constructor, I wanted to note that I think it's important to think of the constructor almost like a factory for spitting out invaders. The function itself takes an x and a y coordinate, And that's part of the data that we need to be able to spit out lots of invaders at once. So we can't build an invader without knowing its location on screen. Probably a good idea in this case. You're seeing here in code the dot syntax for accessing the invader's properties as well. We can reach in and ask for what is this invader's X simply by saying, in this case, print line myInvader.x. That's used for both methods and properties. So some quick review questions here. What's the name of the object shown? If you said myInvader, you're right. What parameters does the constructor take? Well, first of all, it's helpful to know where the constructor appears in this code. You are calling the constructor on the line below size, where it says myInvader equals new invader 1050. So judging from that, you might realize that the constructor for this class takes two numbers. It looks to be integers or possibly floats. The next question is, what are two of the methods of an invader? Well, you can probably easily tell from now that display and move are two of the methods that we can see for an invader. So what's wrong with this picture? Thinking back to what we learned about variable scope before, you might notice that the invader is declared only within setup. What that's going to mean is when we get into draw, your program doesn't know anything about myInvader. The invader needs to be declared up at the top simply by saying invader myInvader, and you could leave it at that. So what's wrong with this picture? If you notice that the invader doesn't have any data that specifies where it is, the constructor doesn't have those two variables for its location, that's what's going on here. The invader doesn't know where it's supposed to appear on screen, so you'll probably get an error if you tried to run this code. And finally, what's wrong with this picture? I can tell you that this code will run, but you won't really see what you'll expect to see. If you were looking carefully, you might have noticed that the invader is instantiated properly, the scope is there so that we can see myInvader from all parts of your code, but we've never told the invader to display. So you're going to get a whole big screen of, well, nothing. Well, I hope this has been a good introduction to the ideas of objects, classes, methods, and properties. There's more information on the processing website, including a tutorial that we'll be reading. So our next big project is going to be building Frogger. Let's have some fun.